Imagine standing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest shore. A gigantic container ship continues along its route, even though its crew has not stepped on land for months. At first, you might think the greatest danger is the weather. Storms, massive waves, hurricane-force winds. But experienced sailors will tell you that the real test begins when nothing changes. The same horizon, the same steel walls, the same routine. Day after day, week after week, month after month. So how can human beings survive 9 months in almost complete isolation?
Where do they get drinking water? How do they store enough food? What happens when someone becomes seriously ill? And what happens when the ship itself begins to fail thousands of kilometers from help? The answer is far more complicated than most people imagine. Because a modern cargo ship is not simply a vehicle. For months at a time, it becomes a completely autonomous floating world. Imagine standing on the steel deck of a ship nearly 300 meters long. Directly beneath your feet, a gigantic diesel engine vibrates continuously. The engine is almost as tall as a 3-story building. Its enormous pistons never stop pushing, driving a vessel weighing tens of thousands of tons through the open ocean. From the outside, the ship looks like an impregnable steel city. But deep inside that steel structure, a countdown has already begun. The first enemy is not outside the ship. It is isolation. The human brain is designed to constantly receive new sights, sounds, people, and experiences. But at sea, those stimuli disappear. The horizon barely changes. The routine repeats itself. And eventually, the mind begins to feel the weight of the isolation. Yet the most immediate physical threat is hidden even deeper. At the bottom of the engine room, a network of pipes and machines is responsible for something far more important than propulsion. It is responsible for keeping the crew alive. Because there is one thing a ship can never carry enough of for a 9-month voyage: fresh water. And this is where the first major engineering challenge begins. Carrying enough fresh drinking water for 9 months would be almost impossible. A huge tank filled with water could weigh hundreds or even thousands of tons. That enormous additional weight would consume valuable cargo capacity and affect the ship's performance. And seawater is not an alternative. It contains so much salt that drinking it only makes dehydration worse. The human body loses more water trying to remove the excess salt than it gains from drinking the seawater. So, how does a ship survive? It makes its own fresh water. Deep inside the vessel is a desalination system. In principle, the process resembles a giant industrial version of a household kettle. Heat from the ship's machinery is used to warm seawater. Inside the desalination unit, the pressure is reduced. This allows the water to boil at a much lower temperature. The resulting vapor rises through the system, leaving most of the salt behind. Then the vapor cools against pipes and surfaces, condenses, and becomes fresh water. That water is collected in storage tanks and distributed throughout the ship. It sounds simple. But imagine what would happen if this system suddenly failed in the middle of the Pacific. No port, no replacement machine, no supermarket, no tanker truck arriving with emergency supplies. Just thousands of kilometers of ocean. And this is exactly where a self-sufficient ship can suddenly become a steel trap. In one reported scenario, a large cargo vessel was thousands of kilometers from the nearest port when a serious problem developed in its desalination system. Salt deposits clogged the heat exchanger plates. Pressure began rising. A pump failed. In principle, the process resembles a giant industrial version of a household kettle. Heat from the ship's machinery is used to warm seawater. Inside the desalination unit, the pressure is reduced. This allows the water to boil at a much lower temperature. The resulting vapor rises through the system, leaving most of the salt behind. Then the vapor cools against pipes and surfaces, condenses, and becomes fresh water. That water is collected in storage tanks and distributed throughout the ship. It sounds simple.
But imagine what would happen if this system suddenly failed in the middle of the Pacific. No port, no replacement machine, no supermarket, no tanker truck arriving with emergency supplies. Just thousands of kilometers of ocean. And this is exactly where a self-sufficient ship can suddenly become a steel trap. In one reported scenario, a large cargo vessel was thousands of kilometers from the nearest port when a serious problem developed in its desalination system. Salt deposits clogged the heat exchanger plates. Pressure began rising. A pump failed. Hot vapor escaped into the machinery space. The crew had only a tiny amount of usable water left. There were more than 20 people on board, while temperatures inside the engine room approached 45 degrees Celsius. Engineers working in those conditions could lose liters of fluid through sweat every hour. Without drinking water, their strength could disappear rapidly. Help from shore would take days. Then, one engineer noticed something unexpected. The ship's air conditioning system was producing clean condensation. Instead of allowing that water to drain away, the crew collected it. They filtered it and treated it before use. Within hours, the emergency system was producing hundreds of liters of water per day. The ship had survived its first invisible crisis. But another problem was waiting in the cargo holds. Because water can keep people alive for days, food has to keep them alive for months. Now imagine opening a massive steel door in the ship's refrigerated storage area. A cloud of white vapor rushes toward you. Inside, the temperature is around minus 20 degrees Celsius. Rows of meat, fish, frozen vegetables, and other supplies fill the enormous storage spaces. This is not an ordinary refrigerator. It is the ship's food reserve for months of isolation. The stores have to be divided into different zones. One section is used for deep frozen food, another is kept cool for fresh vegetables and fruit, and a third is a dry storage area containing flour, grains, canned food, and other supplies. But there is one rule that matters everywhere. Moisture must be controlled. If warm, humid ocean air enters a dry storage room, it can destroy enormous quantities of food. Flour can become damp. Grains can develop mold. And supplies that were supposed to last for months can become unusable. But the greatest nightmare begins when the refrigeration system fails. Imagine being thousands of kilometers from land in tropical temperatures while the ship's main cooling unit suddenly stops working. The temperature inside the freezer begins climbing, slowly at first, then faster. Frozen food starts to thaw, and the crew knows they have only a limited amount of time before bacteria begin turning the food supply into a serious health hazard. This kind of problem became especially important during the global port restrictions of 2020. Some commercial ships remained at sea for extraordinary periods because crews could not easily enter ports or be replaced. On one vessel operating in extreme heat, the main refrigeration system failed. The crew immediately entered a race against time. Hundreds of kilograms of frozen food had to be moved into emergency storage areas. The cook began strictly controlling food portions. Every can, every kilogram of dry food, every remaining supply. Nothing could be wasted. Fresh vegetables eventually became scarce, so the crew improvised. Green onions were grown in small containers inside the ship's galley. Remaining flour was turned into simple dry bread. Dried herbs were carefully rationed and added to hot broth. It was no longer normal cooking. It was survival management.
And through strict discipline, the crew managed to stretch its supplies for months.
But food was not the only resource that could disappear, because even if everyone had enough to eat and drink, one serious medical emergency could still turn the ship into a floating hospital. And there was a problem. There was no doctor on board. Imagine that a sailor suddenly develops severe abdominal pain during a storm. The nearest hospital is thousands of kilometers away. The ship cannot simply turn around, and there is no professional doctor standing beside you. Instead, you are surrounded by steel walls, medical supplies, and a satellite communication system. The person lying in front of you is your crewmate, and their life may depend on what you do next. On many ordinary commercial cargo ships, there is no full-time doctor. Instead, specially trained crew members are responsible for medical emergencies. They have medical kits, reference manuals, emergency equipment, and communication links to medical professionals on shore. When a serious illness occurs, the ship can contact a maritime medical service. Doctors on land can then guide the crew through the necessary procedures. But imagine trying to perform delicate medical work during a violent ocean storm. The ship is constantly moving.
The floor is rising and falling beneath your feet. Tools can slide across the room. A simple task like inserting a needle becomes extremely difficult. It is like trying to thread a needle while standing on a moving carousel. And the doctor may be thousands of kilometers away. In a serious emergency, the crew may have to stabilize the patient until the vessel can reach a port or a rescue operation becomes possible. Strong antibiotics may be administered. Intravenous fluids may be given. Wounds can be treated. And critical instructions can be delivered step by step through satellite communication. There have even been cases in which doctors on shore guided crews through serious medical emergencies while ships were still far out at sea. The captain may adjust the ship's heading to reduce its motion.
The crew secures the medical equipment, and everyone follows the doctor's instructions as precisely as possible. Sometimes the struggle continues for hours. But if the patient survives, the crisis is not necessarily over. Because there is another enemy on a long voyage, and this one cannot be repaired with tools or medicine. It lives inside the human mind. After months at sea, something strange begins to happen. The ship is still moving, the engine is still running, the waves are still hitting the hull, but the outside world seems to disappear. You sit inside your cabin. The walls vibrate continuously. A deep mechanical hum comes from the main engine. At first, you barely notice it. After several weeks, your brain learns to ignore it. But after months of exposure to the same environment, the monotony can become exhausting. The most dangerous psychological period may not be a violent storm. It may be complete calm. There is almost nothing new for the senses to process. The same ocean, the same sky, the same corridors, the same faces, day after day, for months. Psychologists describe this kind of deprivation as sensory monotony. When the brain receives too little new information, it can begin interpreting ordinary sounds and sensations in unusual ways. A wave hitting the hull can sound like knocking. A vibration from the engine can resemble a distant voice. A mechanical noise behind a steel door may suddenly sound like someone calling your name. The brain is trying to create familiar patterns from meaningless background noise. That is why strict routines are so important on long voyages. Crew members need personal space. They need predictable schedules. They need work. And they need ways to occupy their minds. On a ship, even small conflicts can become serious when the same people are living together for months inside a confined environment. There is nowhere to simply walk away. No different neighborhood, no crowded city, no weekend trip. The ship is your workplace, your home, and your entire world. So discipline becomes a survival tool. Keeping busy gives the brain something to focus on. Maintenance work, navigation,
cleaning, inspections, exercise, communication with family. Every activity helps break the endless repetition. But just when the crew becomes accustomed to isolation, another danger can appear from outside. And unlike loneliness, this threat can arrive in complete silence. It can appear suddenly on the radar. And by the time the crew sees it, there may be only minutes to react.
It is nighttime. The ocean is almost completely black. The navigation bridge is quiet. Then an alarm suddenly sounds. An unidentified contact is moving rapidly toward the vessel. The crew watches the radar screen. The distance is closing. Then, two fast boats emerge from the darkness. They approach the massive cargo ship at high speed. A metal hook catches the ship's side. The problem is obvious. A giant cargo vessel weighing tens of thousands of tons cannot maneuver like a speedboat. It cannot simply turn around and escape. And the crew has another limitation. A civilian merchant ship is not a warship. In many ports and jurisdictions, carrying weapons creates serious legal and operational complications. So commercial vessels rely heavily on defensive engineering and emergency procedures. Anti-climb barriers can be installed around vulnerable areas. High-pressure water systems can make boarding extremely difficult. And if attackers still manage to reach the vessel, the crew can activate the final line of defense, the Citadel, a protected internal compartment designed to keep the crew safe during a hostile boarding. The crew enters. The doors are secured from inside. Communication systems remain available. The ship can then become effectively useless to the attackers. Without the crew, they may be unable to operate the engine or navigation systems. This strategy has been used during real piracy incidents. In one well-known case involving a merchant vessel in the Gulf of Aden, the crew withdrew into a protected citadel while attackers gained control of parts of the ship. The vessel's systems were shut down. The crew remained hidden inside the secured compartment. The attackers tried to force their way through the reinforced door, but the barrier held. The crew waited for assistance while maintaining communication with outside authorities. Eventually, a military response team arrived, and the crew was rescued. Everyone survived. The lesson was simple. On a merchant ship, survival does not always come from fighting. Sometimes it comes from refusing to give the attacker what they need: control of the crew. But there is one threat that no citadel can stop: the ocean itself. And when the next crisis arrived, it came with a sound every engineer fears. The main engine stopped. A violent storm surrounds the ship. The wind is screaming across the deck. The waves are growing higher. Then, deep inside the engine room, the enormous diesel engine produces a strange metallic sound. And suddenly, silence. The main engine has stopped. The lights in the machinery spaces disappear. Emergency lighting comes on. The ship is now a massive steel object drifting in a violent ocean. And this creates an extremely dangerous physical problem. A powered ship can use its propeller to maintain control over its heading. But when propulsion disappears, the ship becomes much more vulnerable to wind and waves. The hull can begin turning broadside to the waves. And that is exactly what the crew does not want.